I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago.
Hi, it's J6. I'm here with my friend's dad, Mr. Medina, who lived in Chicago during the time that Martin Luther King Jr. made his visit, and he is here to give some first-hand accounts of what happened.
But the conditions in Chicago were not as bad as in some places in the South, but they were still, Chicago was, even today, is known as a very segregated city. But at that time, it was a little worse. There were places in Chicago where African Americans knew that we just didn't visit while he was here, which he was aware of these restrictions, was Marquette Park.
And we're going to make it an open society. And we feel that we have to do it this way in order to bring the evil out into the open.
When Dr. King came to the city, I think that his focus at that time was to bring attention to the segregated condition of the city.
Open housing in Chicago. Also, he came to help desegregate or integrate the schools.
And he advocated nonviolence, and his strategies was marching, the sit-ins, and protests. But even those seemingly nonviolent acts at that time were perceived threatening.
And a rock hit Dr. King in the back of the neck, knocking him to his knees.
It was shocking and it was hurtful, but I must be honest that it was not really surprising. Even more so than Dr. King's visit here to the city, I think more than anything what galvanized people here in Chicago and maybe across the country to civil rights activities was the murder prior to Dr. King coming here of Emmett Till.
The place where all the violence occurred was in Marquette Park.
I think the Marquette March was important as far as bringing attention to the housing conditions here in the city of Chicago. The conditions, though, were so entrenched, I don't really think it made a great change because the majority of African Americans in the city at that time lived on the south and west sides. And by the 60s, the slum conditions had gotten much, much worse. And blacks were very much concentrated in the ghettos on the south side. And then the west side also, they moved to the west side too. And a lot of times it probably wasn't kept up. So the housing conditions were very poor. Now you add those poor conditions in housing with confined communities where you can't move out and better yourself, it's just a volatile condition. So as late as the mid-50s, you know, there were restrictions in the ownership and where blacks could move. And then the neighborhoods where we were allowed to move into became subject to what is known as blockbusting, where unscrupulous real estate agents would come in the neighborhood and they would scare the people. They would come to knock on the white resident's door and say, well, there's a black moving down the street. You better sell your house now and get out while you can. And they force the people to sell their house for little or no money. And once that one white person sells their house and then a black family moves in, a lot of time many other white families would move off the block. His march, I think, called attention to that, and him moving into a segregated area on the west side, on Hamlin Avenue, brought attention to those conditions more than anything else. As far as changing those conditions, it was a long time before those conditions changed. And as I mentioned to you, many years later, Marquette Park was still very much segregated. It's quite different now, but this is many years later.
The city and the Chicago Freedom Movement hammered out what's called the Summit Agreement, which basically was a lot of words promising to do better, promising to work for an open city, but there was no real enforcement component. And that, I think, was always frustrating for Dr. King. Some historians, some activists always look at Chicago as a defeat for King.
I think it was very effective in that eventually There was a Fair Housing Act enacted. Eventually there was a Fair Voting Act enacted. And even though even today there's still complaints about the unfairness in the electoral system, unfairness in the housing, change doesn't come about all at one time. So I think it was very effective.
The Chicago Freedom Movement set in motion a lot of what came to be. For example, the election of Harold Washington, the first African-American mayor of Chicago.
Because conditions were slow to change here. But by him coming to a northern city and pointing out that some of the same conditions that we faced in the South were existing here in the city, and that being broadcast throughout the country, I think that did much to alert common people to the fact that this is a problem. I think that his work was very important to bring in these poor conditions to the viewing of the public. Yeah. After Dr. King's assassination, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was one of his close associates, began an organization here in Chicago called Operation Breadbasket. And I think much of what Dr. King represented, they tried to follow through and establish here in the city.
All right, thank you very much for your time. It was very informative.
My pleasure.